Imagine you're on your way back from work. You've just stopped to get stuff at the shop and you're looking at a picture of your beautiful wife on your phone. And then suddenly, everything goes black. You're approached by a mysterious figure in the dark who tells you to find Jerry, and the next thing you know, you wake up in a random house in a different realm. Well, that's exactly what happened to me. I've documented the next 100 days so you can see what I get done, who I meet, and what mysteries I uncover. Day 1 was pretty straightforward. I easily found a grave just up from the house and dug up Jerry, who was a bouncing skull and turns out to be somewhat of an alcoholic. The bouncing skull wasn't strange enough. I went down to the road and met a communist donkey. I decided there and then that donkey and I would become great friends. I then did my first autopsy on a body the donkey had brought me. I extracted the flesh and then learned the recipe for burgers, sandwiches and baked meat. Obviously these recipes were in the corpse's pocket, so I was proud of myself for not letting them go to waste. I buried the corpse and Jerry told me to sell the death certificate at the tavern. The priest then arrived to the graveyard and Jerry disappeared. Anyway, I met the priest in front of the church and I instantly knew he was the class clown back in the day. Oh, that was an absolute knee slapper. Absolute knee slapper. After practicing his comedy routine on me, he offered me a promotion if I fixed up the graveyard, which was going to take ages. After a bit more chat, I left and made my way to the village. I met a bunch of people around the village and finally got to the tavern keeper. Tried to sell him the flesh I extracted, but he told me he needed a stamp, so that was another quest added to the list. I sold my death certificate and bought a beer for Jerry. I spent the whole of day 2 meeting people around the village and exploring the map. I collected a ton of quests from different villages and they were all connected. I needed to complete one to be able to complete the other, so I just forgot about all of them. I gave Jerry the beer I bought him and he warned me to be more careful about who I spoke to about getting back to my world. Other than that, he was pretty unhelpful. In all fairness, I had been running around talking to everyone about the crazy new world, and it turns out that witches are burnt, and I did not really want to get burnt at the stake, so maybe Jerry was right. I woke up to a ghost who wanted me to get rid of his neighbour in the graveyard, gave me an exhumation license, and left. I was about to do that quest, but I decided to go into the cellar instead. After clearing out the cellar, I built a sawhorse and cut up some logs, and then I got to day 4. Day 4 was quite productive. I exhumed the body and then tried to dump it in the river, but couldn't figure out how to throw it, so I just buried it again, in the same place, and strangely enough this counted as completing the quest. I then cleaned up the graveyard a bit to get the quality up because I wanted that promotion. I then researched the primitive forging tech which allowed me to make iron parts and nails. This tech was pretty useless now, because I didn't have a forge to get iron with, but it was a key tech that I needed to progress, so I wasn't too bothered about getting it. I spent a long time trying to figure out how to use the saw, and it's painful to watch the footage back, so consider yourself lucky that I'm editing it out. And now it was time for me to go and sell both my burial certificate and to collect the reward for my delivery. The reward was a free beer, and I was annoyed because I wasted money on Jerry's beer, so I sold my reward back to the tavern keeper at a loss. For the rest of the day, I walked around and met more villagers. Then day 5 came around. Day 5 was brilliant for me because I finally figured out how to get logs, which was a big step forward. I then got ambushed by Jerry, who told me I had to distract the Inquisitor. So I made my way to Witch Hill, ended up watching the witch burning with the Inquisitor, and it was very wholesome. After the witch burning, I found a burnt house and a single grave. Because I was just starting out, I took the grave decorations as a donation to my graveyard. I researched my second tech called hard parts, which allowed me to amputate more body parts in the morgue. In the morning of day 7, I put some bread on to bake, which was the only time I ever used my oven. I then decided to go and meet the astrologer, who lived on the other end of the map, and I hadn't quite realised how slow walking I was, so it took me basically the whole day to get there. The point of meeting the astrologer was so he could help me activate the portal to get home. The astrologer said that before he'd help me, I had to bring him a skull, which was very illegal, but he didn't seem to care. Since I didn't have one on me, I basically had to walk back across the whole map without having achieved anything for the entire day. When I got home, I found the donkey had delivered a body, so I took the skull for the astrologer. Unfortunately, I had to wait a whole week to give it to him because he only appeared once every week on the blue moon day. I also made a mistake. when I was doing an autopsy on the body, and it gave -3 quality to my graveyard. This was definitely not a good start for me. I then started messing around with logs and realised I could push logs around on the ground instead of carrying them individually. This actually saves a lot of time throughout the entire playthrough, and you'll see me use this a lot. With the arrival of day 8, I had completed my first week in this new realm and was getting a hang of the controls and my jobs. I collected a ton of iron, even though I didn't have a furnace, and gathered a ton of logs and then went to bury a corpse. I collected more resources in the early hours of day 9 and then went to bed to get my stamina back. I decided to fix the corpse tunnel, hoping that the donkey would push the corpses into the morgue for me so I didn't have to carry them inside. I realised I hadn't explored to the north of my graveyard, so I went up there hoping to find something amazing. Somewhat by accident, I found out how to collect honey, which was very lucky because I needed it for a quest. After clearing out the bee area, I mined this massive rock and got a rock chunk. I took it home with me and put it on the pile. Sadly, I didn't have the tech to get beehives yet, but that was something for me to do later. It turned night time as I was clearing up and got into my first fight. There were 3 bats, and I managed to take them out, and I only lost half my health, which was very embarrassing. On day 10, I researched the simple gravestone tech, which allowed me to put headstones and fences around the graves to raise the quality. I was really going for this promotion I had been offered. I then went to sleep to replenish my stamina and health because I was running low on both. I added some headstones to my graveyard to get the quality up even more. As you can tell, I really wanted that promotion. On my way home, I also found a corpse outside on the ground. It was unexpected because I thought I'd repaired the corpse chute, but apparently Donkey wanted to assert his dominance by playing by his own rules. I buried the corpse and started collecting resources again. I worked through the night and started day 11 the way I finished day 10, by collecting resources. I unlocked the stone cutting tech somewhere along the journey, which made my efforts in collecting all the stone quite worth it actually. I mined 2 stone slabs, and I was very happy when I found out that the pushing method that I used for the logs also worked on the stone slabs. This made my life a lot easier. I then decided I wanted to do some gardening, so I marched all the way to the tavern to ask how I could start. The tavern keeper then told me I had to ask the merchant to use it since it was his land. Sadly, the merchant wasn't in town, so I had to wait till he turned up. On my way home, I saw Donkey bringing me another corpse. Unfortunately, Donkey wasn't in a good mood, so he didn't want to talk to me. His bad mood was further confirmed by the fact I watched him dump the body on the ground, right in front of the perfectly good corpse chute. Donkey obviously ran the show around these parts, so I did the only thing I could, which was nothing, but dragged the corpse inside myself. I took the corpse's flesh, because I thought, once I got the meat stamp, I could sell all of the collected flesh, and I viewed it as some sort of investment, hoping I'd make money later. I then had to go to bed for stamina. After waking up, I tried to sort my garden out, but I didn't have any seeds. I then went to visit the Inquisitor, since he told me last week he had a job for me. He wanted some firewood and flyers to promote the witch burning, because he realised less and less people were turning up, and he was getting embarrassed, because he wasn't the cool kid anymore. I built a forge, and then immediately decided my work area was terrible. I spent the rest of the day deconstructing and reconstructing my whole setup to make it more efficient. This took me way longer than expected. The first thing I did on day 13 was get the beekeeping tech. I don't know why, since I never used it. I also got the decay tech, which I did actually end up using, which was quite nice and helped with gardening. I remembered I had a corpse waiting for me. Once again, Donkey made sure not to put it in the chute, and I was getting used to this disrespect. I quickly buried it so I could get on with the day. I remembered I had a skull to give to the astrologer, so I started the hike to the lighthouse to give it to him. After a few years of walking, I finally made it to the lighthouse, and unlike when I gave Jerry his quest item, the astrologer was actually quite helpful. He explained that the previous graveyard keeper also had an interest in the portal on Witch Hill, and that he had a diary in the cellar beneath the church. This made my next objective very clear. I had to get the church open. This meant I had to improve the graveyard quality significantly to get that promotion from the priest. After the astrologer finished his never-ending speech, he gave me a key to the cellar. I then headed back to the house and collected resources for the rest of the night, whilst heroically fighting off the bats. I mostly slept through the main part of day 14 because I'd stayed up very late collecting resources, but I did meet the priest, who was incredibly unhelpful. That night, I went to collect more stone slabs to the north of the graveyard. I started day 15 by cutting down my slabs into gravestones. I wanted to do this so that my graveyard quality could be so high that the next time the priest visited the church, he would be forced to give me that promotion. I researched advanced forging that day, which allowed me to make an iron anvil. This sounds impressive, but it didn't actually make any difference and did nothing new that my old anvil couldn't do. Then I had to sleep to regain some stamina and got back to work. Once I woke up again, I fixed my pickaxe and I went to the mortuary and fixed the planning board. This allowed me to make another pallet so I could slap another body on it, but I didn't use this for the next 35 days. Day 16 brought with it a moment of realisation and sadness. I found out there was a second part to the corpse chute and quickly fixed it up. This meant this whole time I was blaming poor Donkey for not putting the corpses through the chute, even though it was my fault. The feeling of guilt stuck with me for the rest of the playthrough. Anyway, I wanted to take my gardening seriously, so I decided to try and buy seeds from the guy in the cornfield, but he didn't have any. I then met the merchant. I tried to scare him to cure his hiccups, and even though it seemed to work, he still insisted I get him some hiccup grass. In terms of letting me use the garden, he wanted proof that I was capable, so I had to bring him some of my crops as proof of my elite gardening ability. I bought some grape seeds off him, thinking I could plant them in my garden at home. Spoiler alert, I couldn't. After talking to the merchant, I went to the tavern and bought a thing called a teleport stone. I couldn't get it to work, so for the next remaining days, it stayed in the chest at home. I found the farmer and bought a various assortment of seeds from him. On my way home, I also found Donkey, but he didn't want to talk to me. The guilt I was feeling every time I saw Donkey was excruciating. I had to keep going. Luckily, the corpse chute was now fully working, and so I cut the body up and buried it with the rest of them. Started day 17 by outlining the garden, but didn't actually build anything. Instead, I started cutting stone to get enough red experience points to unlock the woodworking tech. If you didn't know, there are 3 types of experience points in the game. The red ones symbolise construction, the green ones symbolise nature, and the blue ones symbolise anything to do with faith and the dead. You get experience points by completing activities, and each activity gives you a different amount of points depending on what it is. Stone cutting gives you red points, and collecting honey gives you green points. I didn't have any blue points at the time, but I worried about that later. I collected and buried another body. At this point, I wasn't worried about their quality for 2 reasons. The first reason was, I had no idea which parts to take out to improve their quality. So for all my efforts, I would often just make a mistake and make the quality worse. The second reason was I could just make fences and gravestones, slap them on the graves, and make the quality good again. So I was never too worried. Having said that, this idea of just putting terrible quality bodies in the ground was actually a terrible strategy in the long run. You'll come to see this later in the video. I started the day by sleeping to get back stamina. Once I'd woken up, I walked into town and sold my death certificates. I also found the farmer again and bought some more seeds off him. By the time I got home, it was already dark and I planted my seeds in the moonlight. I spent the morning of day 19 making headstones and fences that I then put up on the graves. I got my graveyard quality all the way up to -7. In my notes it says looking good in brackets, but as you can obviously tell, it wasn't. I also locked the important parts tech that allowed me to take off the brain, heart and the intestines of corpses, which turned out to be something I rarely did. I then went to bed again to get energy. Eventually day 20 rolled around and I buried another corpse in the graveyard. At this point the graveyard was starting to fill up. Hopefully the ghost from day 4 had made some new friends. I then repaired the bridge in the west, which allowed me to access the swamp area. It took me a painful amount of time to navigate my way through the swamp, but once I finally got to the middle, I found some hiccup grass for the merchant. I also found a witch and took my chance to drop some game. As you can tell, it obviously didn't go very well. Instead, I had to help her restore her memory. After I failed to rizz up the witch, I decided to leave the swamp, which once again took absolutely ages. When I got home in the morning of day 21, cut some wood, cut some stone to make into headstones, which I then slapped on the graves to make them look good. The graveyard quality wasn't looking too good because I was burying some pretty bad quality bodies. The problem was I still didn't know which parts to take out to make the quality better, but instead I tried to keep the graveyard quality somewhat respectful by putting down tons of headstones. Later in the day, I also unlocked the tools technology. This allowed me to make tools that weren't absolutely Straight away, I upgraded my axe. At this point, my stamina was so low, I had to go to sleep halfway through the day. Once I woke up and was fully re-energized, I cut down a tree to get some logs. I also wanted to get some iron, but was ambushed by some bats. I was determined to do better in this fight than I did in the last time, so I started slashing at them with my rusty sword. Once I finished demolishing the bats, I got back to mining some iron for the rest of the evening. I started day 22 by researching the improved gardening tech, which allowed me to build gardens with sticks. Now I thought these were just upgraded versions of the normal garden, so I harvested my crops to make space for the upgraded gardens. This mistake cost me a lot of time and stamina, and I started deconstructing the gardens and replacing them with gardens with sticks. This was completely useless because I couldn't plant normal crops there. The gardens with sticks could only be used to plant hop seeds, and I had none of these. After wasting my time in the gardens and using up all my stamina, I headed into the village to give the merchant his hiccup grass. After gobbling down the hiccup grass, he realised he lost his most prized attribute: his taste. He told me to visit the witch in the swamp to get a cure from her. Luckily, I was already ahead of him on that front, and I knew I had to get the witch her memory back first, so this job became something I quickly forgot about. When he was telling me about the witch, he accidentally let slip they used to buy love potions from her. So after all my effort trying to rizz up the witch, I then had to find out that other people in the village were cheating with magic. I was absolutely fuming. For some reason, I still bought some silver star grape seeds off him, and then quickly left to sell my death certificates at the tavern. After my long journey back to my house, I snacked on some of my crops and continued deconstructing the gardens. Talking to the cheating merchant really took it out of me that day. I did some useless gardening and then went to bed to recover my stamina. The morning of day 23 started with me sawing some logs into wooden billets and then chopping those into firewood. I then started smelting iron, because with my amazing foresight, I knew that this would come in handy later on. It was also a good source of passive red points. I finally finished destroying my garden and built my first garden with sticks. I didn't know why I couldn't plant anything in these gardens, so I just gave up and started chopping down some trees for logs. The pushing method was incredibly useful and saved me a few valuable seconds of time. I made some iron parts to upgrade my shovel, but I ran out of energy, so I went for a quick power nap. While I was cutting down some more trees, a corpse arrived. So I cut a headstone and made a fence for the grave because I knew the corpse quality was going to be absolutely atrocious. As I walked into the morgue, Jerry told me there was someone stuck in the north of the cellar, but he didn't remember much more than that. After Jerry was done, I got to cutting up the corpse, but I didn't know what I was doing, so I cut off the flesh as an investment and left the rest. I hurried the corpse into the graveyard and smacked down a gravestone and fence to make sure I didn't lower the graveyard quality too much. Chopped down a few trees on day 24, pushed them to the storage pile to use later. I then decided to use a technology I unlocked ages ago by building a compost pile. I also found these berry bushes by the side of my garden that were great because they had tons of berries that provided me with a lot of energy, so I was happy to make that find. The next item on my agenda was to try and collect honey for Dig, a homeless man I had met during my first few days. This mission was one of the few that went pretty well, since I knew exactly where to get honey from. I also found a few more berry bushes while I was out collecting honey. I then decided to go through the cellar and clear through the blockages. So to get through the blockages, I hammered out some iron parts, thawed some planks, and headed back down into the cellar to clear the passage. I got through to some sort of cross-section area with a gate leading to the north. I assumed the last graveyard keeper's diary was up there, along with the helper that Jerry had talked to me about before. However, I didn't have the key on me, so I decided to go the other way down the very long corridor that took me to two sets of ladders. One of them I couldn't use right now, but the other one took me right into the heart of the village, which actually made travel times a lot shorter. I spent the entire night in the cellar, and as the morning of day 25 dawned, I finally met a guy called Snake. It was probably the worst interaction I've ever had. Before I even went up and talked to him, he threatened to stab me, and the only option I had was to threaten him or leave. I decided to leave because I was absolutely terrified and I wanted to sleep. I woke up halfway through day 26 and started building wooden planks and grave fences. I then collected some peat and maggots from the compost heap and slapped it onto my singular garden bed with a stick. I couldn't plant anything in it, which led me to start building normal garden beds again. I planted some carrots and then went to collect the corpse that was delivered, and on my way I wanted to talk to Donkey, but he must have been quite annoyed because he just walked straight past me. I stole the heart of the corpse and then buried it in the graveyard. I then put some graveyard fences up, and this led into day 27. Before I go into day 26, I want to talk to you about another YouTuber called Floydson. He's actually the YouTuber that inspired this series, and I was watching his videos, his 0 to 100 days, 100 to 200 days, and I think he's also released a 200 to 300 days on this exact game actually as well. I've watched the first 2 videos of the 3-part series, and it really inspired me, and I really enjoyed it. I think he's a really good YouTuber, really very funny. I'll leave a link to his channel in the description of the video. Hopefully you guys go and watch his videos. They're very, very good. I just thought it was important to let you guys know where I got the inspiration from, because it wasn't my original idea, but I'm actually having a lot of fun doing this video. Anyway, back to day 26. I started the day by making some simple iron parts so I could get some decent tools, but instead of building them, I instead completely changed what I was doing and headed into the village. The shortcut through the cellar was saving me an incredible amount of time, so I was loving that, and eventually I got to the tavern where I sold my death certificates and bought some fish fingers because they gave me 30 energy each. After stuffing some fish fingers in my pockets, I ran over to Dig to give him the honey I collected for him. He rewarded me with a recipe for cake, which is nice I guess, but it's not exactly what I was hoping for. After completing that absolutely pointless quest, I headed back to the cellar to figure out how to open the rest of the blockages, and it turns out I needed wooden beams. I looked through my tech tree and found that wooden beams needed 200 red points to unlock. I was nowhere near this, so I left that and decided to do that another day. I ate some fish fingers to give me energy to chop some wood for the furnace. I made some more planks as well and used them to build wooden fences to improve the graveyard quality. I then made my way to the garden and used the power of Google to figure out why the garden beds with sticks didn't work. Needless to say, I left in frustration. I headed over to the graveyard and put everything in its place, and even after all that work, the graveyard still looked atrocious. I started day 27 by planting some crops in the garden that actually worked now. I also upgraded my pickaxe so it would use less stamina, which I'm all for. Having said that, I went back to bed to get more stamina. I woke up and made some graveyard repair kits so I could get that promotion and open my very own church. After repairing the graveyard a bit, the quality went up all the way to 5, which was a new record and also meant that I was going to get the promotion and open the church. I ended the day by using the rest of my stamina to make some wooden planks and then went to bed. Now I just had to wait for the priest to arrive so that I could finally get my promotion. This would unlock an entirely new part of the game that I haven't explored yet, to do with faith, sermons, and other kind of blue point activities. It was a pretty slow start to day 28. I made wooden planks to make grave fences and then went to the garden to harvest and replant my crops. After adding more grave fences to my graveyard, I got the quality all the way up to 13, which was going to blow the priest's socks off. I went back to my crafting area and made more wooden planks, and then I also made my first complex iron parts and some nails. A corpse arriving interrupted my amazing crafting sesh, but work had to be done. Once again I took the flesh, hoping that I could get a stamp and then sell it to the tavern keeper. I was viewing my flesh stockpile as a long-term investment. I finished the day like I started it by making the wooden planks until late into the night. I stayed up all night and morning into the start of day 29. I made some more simple and complex iron parts. After all that, my stamina was gone, so I went straight to sleep. I woke up halfway through the day and made some more grave fences because I was obsessed with getting the quality as high as possible. I planted more carrots and made more graveyard improvements. This was the point where my graveyard quality obsession finally ended, and I went to bed because I was waiting for the priest to arrive so I could collect my promotion. I started day 30 very early and put up a headstone in the graveyard. I then looked through the quests I had and realised I could get the Inquisitor his firewood. I luckily remembered to do this on the day he was around, so I cut some logs and made my way to Witch Hill to find the Inquisitor. I tried to talk to him whilst he was still on his way, but he didn't seem very interested in me, but as soon as he got the chance to catch his breath, he was more than happy to take the firewood. All I needed was flyers to advertise the witch burning, and then I could move on to his next quest. Unfortunately, I didn't have any of the technologies unlocked to get flyers, so that would have to wait for another day. I also managed to convince the Inquisitor to let me use the west side of the graveyard, which was nice because it effectively doubled in size. I cleared out some of the western graveyard and got tons of green points, but my stamina ran out, so I went through the underground passage all the way to the tavern so I could buy more fish sticks and continue working. After I had gotten home, I ate the food in my pocket and started sawing logs into wooden billets. The goal was to open up more passages in the cellar to make it quicker for me to move around. This took me all the way through to the morning of day 31. I started day 31 by clearing a blockage in the cellar. I ran out of energy halfway through, so after a quick power nap, I opened the passage fully. In my notes it says not that useful, and I was right. It just led me to a place I already had access to. The other passages required wooden beams to open, and to learn that tech I needed 200 red points and some blue points, both of which I don't have, and they were going to stay closed for a while. After doing all I could in the cellar, I picked some carrots, but I couldn't figure out how to sell my crops. I had tried to sell them to the tavern a few days ago, which didn't work, so for now I just held on to them for energy. I used the rest of the day to explore more, and to the north of the graveyard I found a big rock that seemed like it would give me infinite amounts of stone. I mined several pieces of stone and used my pushing trick to make a stone train so I didn't have to keep running backwards and forwards. Day 32 started with me making tons of iron parts so I could open the passage to the north of my farm by the infinite stone mine. I will admit that I forgot what I needed to open the path, so I made way too many iron parts just to be sure I had what I needed. I then remembered that this was the day the priest was coming to see my graveyard, and all my hard work on it would finally pay off. He kept his promise and made me a prior of the church. I was introduced to a new resource, which was faith. I would get faith after every sermon I performed, and the better it was, the more faith I got. He didn't explain what I could use faith for, but it turned out to be very important and useful. I then got up to the lectern and delivered an absolute banger of a sermon. I had to get a better prayer to give better sermons and earn more faith, but this turned out to be a longer process than I thought. But I managed to figure this out later in the playthrough. The next place I explored was the cellar under the church. I found a study table that would use faith and science to give me new recipes and items. The problem was, I had no science points at all, so I just kept exploring further. I cleared out a bunch of broken stuff in my cellar to make space for useful things, and once I got above ground, I harvested and replanted some crops, but I was slowly running lower and lower on seeds. I was also running low on stamina. That didn't help when I tried to cut some gravestones, so I went for a quick sleep to get back some stamina. When I woke up on day 33, some rando called Marquise had let himself into my house. He brought me to his camp and I met with an old guy that used to be an inquisitor. I had to listen to a lot of waffle and chat, but let me break it down for you very quickly. Marquise and his group are wealthy people from the town. The Inquisitor took them to prison because he was obsessed with burning people. Marquise and his friends escaped and have built a small camp north of the graveyard and want me to help build it up for them. Like I mentioned, the old guy used to be an Inquisitor, but got replaced by the current one who didn't like him, which is why he was in prison as well. The Inquisitor seemed to know that I was transported to this world by an old god, but he didn't say much more. I then got back home and was looking forward to a quiet day of doing graveyard keeper stuff, but I found Donkey waiting for me outside my morgue. At first I was excited, but then he expressed his dislike for me. He hated my capitalist ways and demanded 5 carrots for every corpse he brings to me because he didn't want to be exploited anymore. He was the only donkey I had met in my entire game, so he had a monopoly on the corpse driving industry, so I had no other option than to submit to his request. After shunning me, Donkey also shot on the road as he left just to display his undeniable dominance once more. I also found 2 corpses, which was something that had never happened before, but suddenly one of them started moving and I met Yorick. Once again, I will summarise for you. Yorick is a wealthy man from the town who was on the run from the Inquisitor because he used to be a bad person, but he had turned good and tried to cleanse his soul. In order to do this, he brought a graveyard keeper's book that told him about a secret room in the morgue, so he decided to come and check it out as his last hope for cleansing his soul of its sins. He said he needed a key to access the room that was apparently on the inside of Jerry's skull, so I convinced Jerry to let me wash him to get the key, but that comes later. This day was just piling work onto me. It was nearly more than I could handle, but you don't pray for lighter burdens, you pray for broader shoulders. With that said, I buried the corpse that wasn't actually a person on the run and went to bed for some stamina. On day 34, I started by getting some wooden planks so I could make a hand mixer in the cellar of the church. I wasn't sure what I could use this for, but I wanted to build it because it sounded cool. I also unlocked the glass technology that allowed me to make glass in furnaces now. This was just to get me closer to the glass blower technology that I needed for a lot of the stuff down in the cellar. I also unlocked paper crafting because the wiki told me I could use research notes at the research desk to get science points, which is something I wouldn't have figured out by myself. I used my science and faith to research maggots and then used a hand mixer to get life solution. I then researched bat wings, and put them in a hand mixer to get chaos solution. Neither of these cool sounding things were useful at this time, so I just stashed them away, hoping they'd come in useful later down the line. I stayed in the cellar throughout the night, all the way into the beginning of day 35. On day 35, I unlocked the writing technology which allowed me to make notes, stories, and chapters, all of which would be used to make better prayers for my sermon to get more faith. I needed more faith because I had just run out trying to research maggots and bat wings. To build a desk, I needed a bunch more fitch and nails, so I went back to my house and gathered the stuff together. It didn't take me long until I had everything ready to make my desk, which I was hoping could help me make better prayers straight away, but of course it wasn't that easy. To make a better prayer, I need a chapter, and to make that, I need notes, which require stories and ink and quill, neither of which I had, so the idea of better prayers was something I was going to have to come back to. I then tried to get some sand, but apparently I didn't have the technology to shovel sand, which is a bit strange since it seems like something you should be able to do without a technology. On my way home, I met Donkey, who seemed to be a bit more excited to see me this time, but only because he was about to enlist me into his secret communist group. He brought with him a list of items I had to collect, and if I didn't, he said he'd burn my house down. The negotiations between myself and Donkey lasted for a long time and were very stressful, but after hours of discussion, I finally managed to get away and went straight to sleep to recover stamina. I woke up very early on day 36 and used my secret passage to get into the village. I then found Dig and brought some oil from him to put on Donkey's cart, which was one of the quests I had collected the previous day. Whilst I was in the village, I also bought some beer to wash Jerry with, so I could get the key for Yorick. The only thing left was to get the sand. To get the key for Yorick, I convinced Jerry to let me wash him with beer and a bit of sand to make him smell a bit nicer. For some reason, I took the long way back home, but it was actually quite nice because I got to go through the wheat field, one of my favourite parts of the game. I oiled up Donkey's cart and sent him on his way. After finding a corpse and burying it, I headed back home to figure out how to get some sand. However, I was greeted by the blacksmith, who said I needed to come to the village meeting because there was a situation that needed my expertise. Once again, I'm going to summarise the whole thing because otherwise it would be a 10-hour long video. The tavern keeper, who was also head of the village, informed everyone that there were vampires running around and attacking villagers. He then opened the discussion up to the floor for suggestions on how to tackle the problem. After being informed about this deadly scourge of vampires, everyone's solution seemed to be to promote their businesses. The carpenter offered to fix people's decks with a 15% discount. After that guy was done shilling himself during a crisis, a guy called Adam spoke up. He started blaming the vampires for some graffiti that was on the side of his house. His solution was to give every villager 2 bodyguards. But I don't think he worked out the logistics of how every single person was going to get 2 private bodyguards. Besides, another villager cleared up that it was just the village teenagers and that he in fact helped them with the grammar whilst they were vandalising Adam's house. The logger got his turn to speak up, and I expected him to be a hardcore lumberjack that would want to go on the offensive. But instead, he turned out to be a vegan that blamed all of this on the fact the villagers were eating meat. The beekeeper was the last to speak, and he revealed something truly terrifying. The beekeeper exclaimed that this was in fact the work of his nemesis, Hornet Man. Luckily, the beekeeper had been preparing for this very scenario, and had been breeding some carnivorous bees that he told us he was nearly ready to unleash onto the villagers. This seemed very calming to hear, but other villagers worried for some reason. Since we didn't come to a clear agreement on a plan, all of the villagers left the tavern and went about their day. The tavern keeper wanted to talk to me and said that I should be the one to uncover the mystery, but not because I was a hero or because I was a trusted citizen, but instead because I lived outside the village, which meant the tavern keeper had to pay less tax to employ me. After that encouraging lecture, I headed back to the graveyard but was ambushed by the shepherd, who was paranoid of vampires. To prove I wasn't a vampire, he forced me to eat a lot of raw garlic, but he was only convinced once I promised to solve the mystery. I can't put into words how much garlic the shepherd made me eat. It was an outrageous amount. In fact, after the interaction, I had a poisoned effect from all the garlic I had eaten. In the evening, I met up again with Donkey, who was here to once again reaffirm that I was part of the Communist Party, and that I had duties to perform or my house would be burned down. My first task was to build a collection bin and put a recipe book inside so that him and his comrades could eat well. Day 37 finally rolled around, and it was very uneventful compared to the previous few days. I spent the morning harvesting some of my crops and replanting them. I was having a problem where I was progressively getting less and less seeds back from each harvest, but since I was responsible, I completely ignored the problem. The evening of the day was spent doing an autopsy of the corpse and then burying him in the graveyard. The quality had started going down because the corpses were in such bad shape, but now I had the church, so I wasn't too bothered about it. The early hours of day 38 were spent mining some stone from the infinite source and pushing them in a line back home. This trick was one of my favourites that saved a lot of time. I met the priest and he told me he needed some bowls because he was going to start his own soup kitchen. This unlocked the ability to collect sand and clay, which is great because now I could get glassware for the cellar. I went on to perform my first sermon by myself, which went pretty terribly and gave me around 3 faith, but this was still better than none. I collected some sand and with the beer cleaned Jerry and secured the key. Yorick used the key to unlock a massive room with a list of strange machines in it. I cleared out the room as best I could and found what looked like a soul box in the corner. Immediately, Yorick opened it and a ghost popped out. We debated on the name for a while, but in the end we landed on Smiley. Smiley didn't have much to tell me, and I was a little distracted by Yorick, who found a trap door that appeared to lead to a room he could stay in. Neither of us managed to open the door, so it became my job to get some oil to loosen the hinges. I also discovered more of Yorick's backstory, and found out he used to live a life of sin, full of girls and drinks, which quickly became an obsession that was caused by his otherwise boring life. He worked as a servant to the judge in a court and wasn't fulfilled at all, so he traded almost all of his belongings to a priest so that he could have his sins washed away. But after the service, he didn't feel any different at all. So he got his hands on a graveyard keeper book that told him how to cleanse his soul, and ended up being on the run from the Inquisitor, which is how he ended up in the morgue in the first place. That's all Yorick wanted to tell me for now, but I'm sure there's a bit more to the story. I forgot to mention, but after finding the ghost, a new tech tree unlocked, but sadly I couldn't unlock a single thing, so I just ignored it completely. I finished the day off by putting 40 carrots in the donkey box, and then went to sleep to recover my stamina. Day 39 started with me making some pages, and then using those pages to get more science points. I put those science points straight to use by researching acceleration powder. After my research was done, a corpse arrived, so I went and buried it straight away. I still wasn't sure how to do an autopsy, so I just slapped it in the ground and got back to the research table. Next, I researched life solution and got some of my first blue points. I then researched flesh, which gave me loads more blue points. I then ran out of faith, so that put a stop to my research, but I'd gotten a few blue points by now, which was great to have. On day 40, I made more chaos solution and life solution, and then wanted to build a church workbench, so I went back and started crafting. I chopped down some trees and made some fitch. I also hammered out some iron parts which allowed me to make the bench, but before that I unlocked a bunch of tech. I unlocked the glass blower tech that allowed me to make chemical flasks, which helped me make more stuff in the church cellar. I also got the comfort of faith tech, which allowed me to make church benches so I could get more faith from my sermons. The next job I tackled was building the church workbench. This allowed me to make paper and hemp rope. I then went back into the tech tree and realised I needed more blue points to unlock the ability to make more fancy conical flasks, so I had to put this job on hold for a while. As I was leaving the church, I decided to check out the royal postbox, and there was a lot on offer, but it was all too expensive. Despite the prices, I did buy rightful citizen papers and a town pass, which I was quite excited about because everyone had been talking about the town and I wanted to see what it was all about. You'll see how that goes later in the video. I ended the day by thinking about doing an autopsy on a body, but then deciding not to because I didn't know what I was doing, so just buried it in the graveyard. On day 41, I decided to go and talk to the ghost that Yorick and I had discovered. Smiler didn't tell me much except for the fact he wanted a berry pie before he'd tell me anything. So that was another quest added to the long list. Whilst it was still nighttime, I decided to go out looking for moths, but even though I searched for the entire night, I couldn't find anything. I found out later that I actually had to pick the flowers to get moths, instead of just walking aimlessly around them. Since I couldn't find moths, I instead decided to mine some iron, since my supplies were running low. I then remembered I had to make bowls for the priest, so I built a potter's wheel so I could get the job done. I made half the bowls but ran out of clay, and then decided I wanted to go through the tunnels and sell my death certificates at the tavern, so that's what I did. I also remembered that the priest said he'd buy bread from me at a premium, so I stocked up on bread from the tavern in the hopes of making a profit. After walking across most of the map throughout this entire day, I ended it by dumping some carrots into Donkey's box. I stayed up throughout the night to make some more bowls for the priest so I could finish the quest for him. I also made more nails and planks so I could build more church benches and get more faith, which I needed for research. I also went back to Yorick and bought him some oil to get the trapdoor open. Yorick seemed to recognise something about the oil, but didn't say much more about it. Anyway, we finally got the door open and found a ruined room, which I promised to fix for a small price. Coincidentally, I had resources on me to fix his broken bookcase straight away, but since I couldn't repair anything else, I left. I went straight to the church and built 2 more church benches, but then I ran out of resources. Not only was I out of resources, but I was also out of stamina, so I went straight to sleep. The last thing I did for the day was perform a terrible autopsy, where I removed the brain and then put it straight back. After putting it back, I made a mistake, which lowered the quality even further, and at this point I knew I just had to bury the corpse or get rid of it, which is exactly what I did just before I went out to look for moths again. I couldn't find any moths, so I just cut down a tree and carried the log all the way back to my house like an absolute monster of a man. I went up north to look for more moths, but didn't find any, so of course I just brought back 3 more logs. Straight away, I made some fitch so I could repair more of Yorick's furniture, which is exactly what I did next. I repaired the bed and found a lost tooth. When I asked Jerry about it, he seemed to think it was his. With some excellent Sherlock Holmes deduction, I deduced that it must have been Jerry's room when he was still alive. I then made my way to the church cellar and made some pigskin paper, which I tried to research but couldn't because I had no faith. The lack of faith really stopped me from doing work underneath the church, so I went up north and collected some berries and mushrooms so I could stay awake for longer. I then made my way back to the morgue and took the flesh off a corpse and buried it in the graveyard. At this point the graveyard was filling up, but because the quality of the corpses I'd buried was so low, they would bring the quality down a lot, which was a problem for me to deal with later. It was finally a church day. This was great because I got to sell the priest some bread and do a sermon for faith. After giving the priest the bowls I made for him, I also tried to cash out with the bread, but it completely backfired because I had to sell it at a loss. The next task the priest gave me was to get 30 graveyard and church quality so I could upgrade the church to the next level. This would give me more faith from my sermons. I then performed another stinker sermon with my terrible prayer and got 1 faith for my efforts. But I did make 15 bronze from the collection box, which was helping me recover from the financial loss I took from the bread. I then used 2 flesh to repair Yorick's rug, which was a bit strange, but he didn't seem to care, so I didn't care. Once I got home with 2 logs, I hammered out some nails and made some wooden billets, which I chopped into firewood. Day 45 then rolled around, and I went and repaired Yorick's plant pot. I then went to the church cellar and wanted to study a brain in the research table, but I didn't have enough faith, so I studied blood instead. Researching blood gave me a few more blue points, which I used to get the advanced smelting tech. I wanted to upgrade the furnace, but I ran out of stamina, so I harvested some crops, ate them and finished the furnace, and then went and buried a corpse. At this point the graveyard quality was properly in the toilet, but I just had to keep going. On day 46 I collected the glass I left in the furnace, I chopped down a tree and hammered some nails and some simple iron parts. I finally cut some stone so I could build a second furnace, so I could have glass and iron smelting at the same time. I opened up the tech tree and got a technology that I've been waiting for a long time, which was the circular saw, which finally allowed me to make wooden beams. I was looking forward to getting wooden beams because it would finally allow me to open up the cellar completely, and so I could travel from place to place a lot more quickly. I crafted some planks, hammered out some simple iron parts and cut some fitch all day, but ran out of stamina to get to bed. On day 47 I did something I wanted to do for a while, which was go into the town. There were many NPCs that spoke about the town, like Yorick and the merchant, so I was looking forward to see what they were going on about. But as soon as I got past the guard, I was struck down by lightning that killed me instantly. When I came back to life, Jerry appeared and told me that a great power didn't want me to go to town, so he had put a stop to my adventures. Jerry also told me I seemed to be invincible, and that I should talk to Snake for more information, but I didn't have a good relationship with him since he threatened to stab me last time, and I haven't really spoken to him since. I also made some complex iron parts so I could make a saw blade which would allow me to finally make some wooden beams. I used up the last of my stamina and then went for a quick sleep. Once I woke up, I made some wooden fixtures and then finally opened up the first passage. I then had to quickly do an autopsy, but I couldn't bury the corpse because I ran out of stamina yet again, so I had to go to bed. I got back to the corpse on day 48 and found a sun shard. I extracted it, but I had no idea what it did, so I just put it in one of my chests. After that, I buried the corpse and lowered the graveyard quality even more. I realised that I was burying way too many poor quality corpses, so I researched the cremation tech so I could get rid of the terrible quality corpses and burn them instead. I finally got back to clearing the passages, which was going to make my life so much easier. I used some wooden beams to fix Yorick's fireplace, and as a reward for fixing his room, he gave me some stained glass windows for the church, which actually looked alright. I also bought a trade license that day, which would allow me to open a shop with the merchant. I got a corpse delivery, but I left it sitting in the table for a while because I ran out of stamina. So instead, I made the journey to town to sell my death certificates, but after that, I went straight to bed. On day 49, I finally buried the corpse that had been sitting on the table for days. I then went to the church and gave another awful sermon, and luckily this time I got 3 faith, which was a new record. It turned nighttime pretty quickly, and I finally figured out how to collect moths, which was to pick flowers, which took me an embarrassing long time to find out. But after that, I went straight to sleep for more stamina yet again. I started day 50 with some light gardening, and then I made the huge journey to the lighthouse to give the fisherman his moths, and I got a fishing rod for my troubles. This wasn't actually a bad trade because fishing in this game was quite fun. I then had to face the long walk back home, which didn't leave me with much time left in the day to do anything else, but I did build my first wood pile to burn a corpse. And as I stood there watching the body burn on the pyre, I thought back to the very little I had achieved in my first 50 days. Thanks again to Floyton for inspiring this series. There's a link to his channel in the description. Check his video out, and I'll see you next time. As a small channel, I'd really appreciate if you hit the like button on your way out. It really helps me out and promotes the videos. Look through some other stuff that I've made, and I'll hopefully see you next time.